Test 1 2 3 1 2 3 test 1 2 3.
Buonasera.
Good evening. My name is Alessandra. I'm part of We Science, the group of young people of Bergamo Scienza. Before starting, a moment of attention. If you connect to the site bergamoscienza.it and clicking on Look Live, it is possible to follow the streaming event on the YouTube channel of Bergamo Scienza. You can also see it on the Facebook page. You can send questions to speakers or invite your friends and followers to follow the conference in streaming. The questions in the web are received by us volunteers, and we will propose a selection. The conference of the 22nd edition of Bergamo Scienza is made accessible to people with sensorial and motor disabilities, trying to guarantee places which do not have architectural barriers, and also we have sign translation. All of the conference are video recorded. Some are broadcast in streaming. Conferences with foreign guests have simultaneous translation. The recordings will be published on our official channels at the end. These services are made possible thanks to the Fondazione della Comunità Bergamasca and the Banca Popolare di Bergamo, which together with Bergamo Scienze are committed in promoting inclusivity and accessibility. For simultaneous translation, you just have to scan the QR code that the volunteers can give you or that you see behind me. The QR code will address you directly to Converso web app, where you will be able to select the language of interpretation from the menu. To listen to the translation, you need headsets, so please use yours. If you do not have them, please ask volunteers to help you. Welcome to the event of this afternoon entitled The Illusion of Memory. How do fake memories, how are they born, and what are the consequences? And we have Elizabeth Loftus of the University of California in Vienna. The conference will be chaired by Nicola Quadri, Association Bergamo Scienza. Please mute your electronic devices and participate in numerous to the initiatives of Bergamo Scienza. Thank you very much for your attention and have a nice conference. Welcome to you all. This evening is a very special one. We're talking about a topic which is very dear to all of us. We all have experiences of this, our memory, and the extent to which our memory can betray us sometimes. It's very, very close to everybody's daily life. It has an enormous impact on many different sectors. We were talking about this with Professor Loftus, who's here with us, to talk to us about this topic that go from the legal issues to disinformation, misinformation, and also mistrust for science. We have the pleasure of doing this today with Elizabeth Loftus, who has arrived from California to talk to us about her experience devoted to the study of memory and to especially how this is malleable. Memory can be malleable. We have always known, it is common experience, that memory can betray us. But up to what point is memory changeable? Can it be modified? Remembering an event, does it mean rewriting it? The relationship between imagination and memory, has it been studied enough in all of its strength and depth during the second half of the 20th century? In the 70s, 80s, we were talking about very recent research, and Elizabeth Loftus has certainly contributed remarkably to this field of research and has made a lot of important breakthroughs. Professor Loftus, a couple of information before leaving her at the stage for the conference. I'm going to read. I don't want to make mistakes. Elizabeth Loftus is Distinguished Professor at the University of California, Irvine, where she teaches in 2 different departments: psychological sciences and criminology, law and society. She has a PhD in psychology at the Stanford University, where she got her degree, published more than 20 books, amongst which Eyewitness Testimony, that has received a lot of awards, and this has been a milestone for the way in which we interpret our capability of being able to trust witnesses, basically, and what somebody might have seen, and more than 600 scientific articles. She has been awarded with 8 honorary PhDs and election of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, American Philosophical Society, and National Academy of Sciences. She's been president of the Association for Psychological Associations and the American Psychology Law Society. And recently she has received a series of awards for the contribution she provided during her career. International Union of Psychological Science Lifetime Career Award, and also the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Western Psychological Society. Without any further ado, I hope I introduced Elizabeth well and her scientific contribution. I'm leaving her the floor. Thank you very much to tell us something more about memory. Thank you.
Okay. Buongiorno, and scusi, non parlo italiano, so I will speak to you in English about my favorite topic, which is the fiction of memory. And since we're here thinking about memory, it's probably worth mentioning that memory is very important to all of us. Without memory, you wouldn't know how to get up in the morning, make coffee, make toast, find your way to the train station, or find your car keys. Memory is that repository of all the wonderful things that happen to us and some of the saddest things that we've experienced. But it doesn't always work perfectly. And so I'd like to ask you, do you think that I could make you remember? If it did not happen, could I make you remember that when you were a child, you saw a cat stuck in a tree and you rescued that cat? Could I make you remember that as a child you were attacked by a vicious animal? Could I remember that as a teen, make you remember, if it did not happen, could I make you remember that as a teenager you committed a crime, and it was a serious crime. The police even came to investigate. Could I make you remember that? Could I make you remember that a week ago you played a card game, and you were playing this card game, and there was money involved, and you took money out of the game bank that you were not entitled to take? What I'm asking here is, could I make you remember these things? Could I pour these ideas into your mind and make you remember these things if they never happen? And when you talk to ordinary people, you will often hear them say, if I would never remember I was attacked by an animal if I wasn't. I would never confess to a crime that I didn't do. If it didn't happen, I would not confess. But we'll see how you feel in another 50 minutes or so. Because I've been studying memory for many decades now, and over the course of this fairly long career, I've developed a couple of paradigms for investigating human memory. And one of those paradigms is called the misinformation paradigm. So what happens here is that we show some event to witnesses, and after the event is over, we give them some post-event information. Often it's misleading information. And then we test people to see what it is they themselves remember about the event. And so, for example, I've done many studies where we show people simulated accidents, sometimes on film, accidents, and we then question them about their experiences. In one of my early studies, we showed people a simulated accident where a car goes through a stop sign without stopping. That's what happens in the accident film. And afterwards, we asked some questions. And one of those questions is this question: did another car pass the red Datsun while it was at the intersection with the yield sign? After we ask this question, we want people to try to tell us what kind of traffic sign, that's their test, that they remember seeing at the intersection. What do they say? And many of them will say they remember a yield sign when it was a stop sign. And this question actually is a lot more clever than you might think on the surface, because this question makes you think that I'm asking you about whether another car passed the Datsun, and while you're thinking about that, I slip in the information that there was a yield sign there. It invades the mind, kind of like a Trojan horse, because you don't even detect that it's coming. And later on, people now remember they saw a yield sign at the intersection, not a stop sign. Well, sometimes this study would get criticized because it was just like a filmed accident. It wasn't a real event. Maybe people who out there in the real world see real accidents or real crimes or real upsetting events, maybe they would not succumb to these kinds of influences. And that's a very good question. It's a question about the extent to which the psychological research tells us about the real world. And one of the ways that we as psychological researchers respond to this question is to go out there and look at people out there in the real world. For example, people out there in the real world who are, for one reason or another, experiencing something very upsetting and arousing. And we did that in a series of studies involving a very unusual group of people. We were studying soldiers. In our military in the United States, some of our soldiers go to survival school. They learn what it's going to be like for them if they are ever captured as prisoners of war. They go through an extremely upsetting weeks of survival school that really teaches them what could happen and how they might cope with a very traumatic experience if it happened to them. So survival school is not very pleasant. And these soldiers in this study, they undergo a 30-minute aggressive, hostile, upsetting interrogation. And I managed to talk the lead investigator, Charles Morgan, a psychiatrist, into putting some misinformation into one of these survival school studies. And so we're going to try to get these soldiers to misremember what happened in that 30-minute interrogation. What did we find? Well, it turns out they might have been interrogated by the person on your left, but we plant the suggestion that it was the person on your right. And many of these trained soldiers would then go on to identify the person on the right as the horrible interrogator, even though he didn't really even resemble the true interrogator. How did we plant that false memory? We did it like this. We said, we're interviewing the soldiers at the end of survival school. Remember back to that 30-minute horrible interrogation that you had? Want to ask you a few questions about this guy who interrogated you. Did he let you speak to anybody else? Did he give you a blanket? Did he give you anything to eat? But the trick is, the photograph that we held up was the photograph of the wrong person. And after that simple manipulation, many of these soldiers went ahead and identified this person, the wrong person, the misidentified person, as the one who had conducted that interrogation. Well, we did more with these soldiers. While they were in the interrogation room, there was no telephone in the room. The guy was not carrying a weapon. He did not have glasses. And when the soldiers were not exposed to misinformation, but had to answer, did you see these objects in the room? They rarely said, yes, I saw those objects. Not never, but rarely. But look what happens when we had a separate group of trained soldiers for whom we had fed misinformation about the objects being in the room. Now, many of them remembered seeing a telephone, and a significant minority also remembered that he was holding a weapon and that he wore glasses when he wasn't. And so I have now treated you to a brief summary of something that we refer to as the misinformation effect. And this is kind of a cartoon drawing of that effect. If you expose people to misinformation, if you put them in a misled condition, you will depress their memory performance. And why that is important is this. Because out there in the world we live in, misinformation is everywhere. We get misinformation, for example, when we talk to other witnesses who might have experienced a similar event, and we share information and sometimes it's wrong. We get misinformation when we're interrogated by investigators who have an idea about what happened and maybe communicate that idea to the person being interviewed, even inadvertently. And we get misinformation when we turn on the news, particularly if we've seen a high publicity event. There can be news, TV news, internet news, what have you, about the event, and sometimes misinformation gets communicated in that setting. And in all of these situations, the potential is there for that misinformation to enter our minds and cause a contamination, distortion of our prior memory. So after I'd been working on misinformation for quite a while, I ended up getting a call from an attorney who told me that he was representing a man accused of murder. He said, my client, his name is George Franklin, who you see on your left, he was accused of murdering a little girl, an 8-year-old girl, 20 years ago, and the only evidence against him was the testimony of his daughter, Eileen Franklin, whom you see there, and she said, I saw my father kill my little best friend. He raped her, and then he killed her. I saw it. I repressed my memory for 20 years, and now the memory is back. She contacted the police, and she told the police a very specific story, and George Franklin was prosecuted. And his lawyer said to me, what do you know about this idea of repression? I said, well, because actually the daughter would be claiming that she repressed her memory not only for witnessing this rape and murder, but she also repressed her memory for years of sexual abuse committed upon her by her father, by other men she invited to join. She repressed, it turns out, her memory for other murders, she said. And I told the lawyer, I said, you know, I've been studying memory for quite a while, and I've heard of the word, the concept. It's kind of a hand-me-down Freudian idea that you can have a whole collection of traumas. You can banish them into the unconscious. You can wall them off from the rest of mental life, and somehow you can peel away that layer of repression, and out comes these pristine memories. But to be honest, I don't know what the evidence is for it. And so I began to examine the literature, and to my surprise, there was no credible scientific support for this idea of massive repression. There is support for the idea that you cannot think about something for a long time, even something awful, and be reminded of it. Of course that happens. But the idea of this massive repression, something too extreme to be explained by ordinary forgetting and remembering, no credible scientific support. And yet, the jury believed Eileen's story. The jury was bolstered by a psychiatrist who said that she believed that Eileen's story was real and that repression was real. And the jury convicted George Franklin of murder. And he became virtually the first American citizen to be convicted of murder based on nothing other than a claim of massive repression and the return of the repressed memory. But soon after that, we started to see lots of other people claiming that they repressed their memories, not for murder, but for sexual abuse. One example was the actress Roseanne, who said that she was molested by her mother when she was 6 months old, that her father joined in when she was older, to repress these memories. She said she became a multiple personality patient. I think she thought she had 17 personalities. And these cases started to populate our social media, and various other people came out with their stories of repressed memory. Sometimes these memories were really bizarre. My father made me go into satanic rituals. He made me kill animals. He made me breed babies. He made me kill those babies. Despite the fact that the FBI, even though it seemed that these were coming out of some kind of psychotherapy, the FBI still started to investigate, and an FBI agent who was quite well known then wrote a report saying, I've never found any corroboration for these satanic ritual abuse claims that are floating around. So what is going on here? What is going on? How is it that these people, most of whom went into therapy for one problem, could come out and have this new problem? this collection of trauma memories that they thought they repressed and recovered. I'd been studying the misinformation effect for a long time, and I'd shown you could turn a stop sign into a yield sign. You could make a soldier believe that there was a weapon when there wasn't, make him misidentify a person who had been horrible to him. But this is changing a detail for an event that actually did happen. And what might be going on here, if these memories aren't real, is an entire event is being planted into the minds of these patients. So this old misinformation paradigm really wasn't going to cut it. We needed a new paradigm, because I wanted to study how you could plant a seed of suggestion and it could grow into something so big. So now our new paradigm, which is now called in the literature the Richfall's memory paradigm, there's no event to begin with, but we just ply people with suggestions about the past, and then we question them about their memories for their childhood or their more recent past. Okay, what are we going to plant? There I was, I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know what kind of memory I should try to plant in people. Because if you work on a college or university campus, you know that when you want to do research with human beings, you have to get approval. So you go to a human subjects review committee, you tell them your idea for a study, and they give you permission to go ahead and do the study. It didn't seem likely that my committee would think very fondly on a proposal to plant memories that your father forced you into satanic rituals and made you kill animals and breed babies. We needed an analog. We needed to find something to plant that, if it had happened, it would have been at least mildly traumatic for the subject. And so we eventually came up with the idea, why don't we get people to try to believe and remember that when they were 5 or 6 years old, they were lost in a shopping mall. They were frightened, crying, and they were ultimately rescued by an elderly person and reunited with the family. And we planted that false memory, that rich false memory, into the minds of about 25% of ordinary, healthy adults. A partial memory or a complete false memory. Well, that study got criticized. I think the critics could see, even before we published the results in a scientific journal, the critics could see that where I was going with this. And they said, look, getting lost is so common. At least show us you can plant a false memory for something that would be more upsetting, more horrendous, more arousing. And so we and other investigators came along and did just that. A group in Tennessee planted a false memory that when you were a kid, you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard, using our methodology, but a different item. They succeeded with about a third of their sample. A group in Canada planted a false memory that when you were a kid, you were attacked by a vicious animal or something other serious happened to you, like an indoor accident or outdoor accident. They succeeded with about 50% of their subjects. And another group in Canada planted a false memory. When you were a teenager, you committed a crime, and it was serious enough that the police actually came to investigate. And they reported success with about 70% of ordinary, healthy adults. Well, how often does it happen that people fall for these suggestions? A great big mega-analysis was done using investigators and data from Great Britain, from Canada, and also from the United States. There's now a whole collection of these rich false memory studies out there. They brought all the data together. They recoded the items so they would use a common coding scheme. How do you classify something as a false memory or not a false memory? They ended up with 423 people who had been exposed to this kind of manipulation that I'm talking about. The strong suggestion that we've talked to your parents, they basically said this happened to you. And this mega-analysis that I wasn't involved in, other investigators were, showed that about 30% of the time people developed a false memory, and an additional 23% of the time these subjects developed a false belief that this event had happened, even if they didn't have this sense of recollection. That's important because we believe that just getting people to believe that something happened to them or might have happened to them is the first step on that royal road to developing a full-blown false memory. We've used other techniques to plant false memories, many of them deriving from some of the things that I saw in the highly suggestive psychotherapy that I was seeing in the court cases that involved claims of massive repression. Some of these procedures involved guided imagination or sexualized dream interpretation, sometimes hypnosis. But what I want to turn my attention to now is this question. If I plant a false memory in you, does it have repercussions? Does it affect your subsequent thinking, your subsequent intentions, or even your behavior? And we investigated this question about the consequences of a false memory with a series of studies where we planted a false memory. As a child, you got sick eating a particular food. So for some people, they got sick eating eggs. For others, they got sick eating pickles. For others, they got sick eating strawberry ice cream. And when we planted this false memory in the minds of these subjects, they weren't as interested in eating these foods. In fact, you could put foods in front of them on a different occasion, a week later or something, and see what they eat. And they didn't eat as much of the offending food. So it actually affected their behavior. And we found you could do the opposite. We could plant a warm, fuzzy memory about a healthy food like asparagus, and people want to eat more asparagus. And it's not just food. We even showed with vodka. You can plant a false memory as a teenager. You got sick on a vodka drink, and people are not as interested in drinking a vodka drink. This hasn't worked for me personally, but it did work for these subjects. So you may have questions about this mind engineering, because I've given talks like this in a number of places. So I know what some of your questions are likely to be. And I'll raise them now, and you can have other questions later if I don't address your question. But I'm often asked, is there any way to tell the difference between a true memory and a false memory? I mean, you might think that people are more emotional about their true memories than they are about false memories that we plant in them. But in fact, in a study done with my former PhD, Dr. Laney, now Professor Laney, as part of her dissertation work, we showed that the false memories are held with just as much emotion as true memories. She planted false memories in some people of events that would have been at least mildly upsetting if they had happened. You caught your parents having a physical fight. You accidentally walked in on your parents while they were having sex. She found other people who truly had this experience, and the emotional rankings, feelings of the true memory group and the false memory group were similar. Well, maybe the brain knows. Maybe if we could put people inside a fMRI scanner and get neural signals while people are reporting a true memory versus a false memory, maybe those neural signals would be different and would tell us, would help us discriminate. But teaming up with investigators who know a whole lot about fMRI and do it regularly, we put people into the scanner while they were remembering something true or something false that we had planted. And the overwhelming result here is the similarity of those neural signals comparing a true memory to a false memory. I get asked this question, are we all susceptible? I had a chance to do an experiment with a really special group of people. The neurobiologists on my campus were studying a group of people who have superior memory. They remember just about every day of their life as adults, just about every day of their life. They've been studied extensively. There are not that many of them. Maybe they know about 100 or so. And they've been featured on news programs. They've been interviewed a lot. They're really a special group of people. What would happen if you tried to distort the memories of this special group of people with superior memory? That's what we did. We took the people with superior memory. We tried to plant false information in their minds and in the minds of age and gender match controls. And even this special group, the superior memory group, were just as susceptible to memory contamination. By the way, sometimes people ask me about what happens to these people that you run in your experiments after the experiment is over. Do you leave them with the false memory? Well, we do debrief our subjects at the end. That is required. That's extremely customary. We tell them that we're sorry to deceive them, that their memory is false. And most of the time, we don't ever see them again. But in a few recent studies, we've built into the protocol the ability to come back later and ask, what do they have in memory? Do they still have that yield sign in memory? Or is it no longer in their memory? And one of the things these debriefing studies have shown is that there may be a little speck of fiction still floating around, but there's also some benefits of having been through this process. In one of our studies, it made our subjects somewhat more resistant to future attempts to manipulate them. These memory implantation studies are very time-consuming. We had some very time-consuming ways of planning the false memories, but we've now discovered a really nifty, easy way to plant false memories. We'll call this the memory blindness technique, where you ask people questions about the past, and they tell you yes or no. I went to a birthday party with a clown, or I flew in an airplane, or whatever. And then later, you might come back to them a week later and say, we want to ask you some things about the things you told us happened to you. Some of them are ones that the subject really did say happened, but one was not. One was not. And I'll skip over the original work on memory blindness to just in the interest of speeding up this talk a little bit and tell you what happened in a Dutch study that used this technique to plant a rich false memory. This is work by Otgar, who's at Maastricht University, published just a couple of years ago. And he used this method and got people to start to remember and to remember that they'd gone swimming as a kid and lost somehow their swimming clothes had fallen off in the water. And earlier this year, with my collaborators at Florida International University, we used this method to plant a false memory that as a child, something physically invasive had happened to you that they had previously denied, namely that you had a rectal enema, and a significant minority began to remember it. You don't need all this deception. In one study, we got people to develop false memories by just asking them to make up a story about finding a cat stuck in a tree and rescuing that cat while you were a child. And after making up a convincing story, later on people started to believe and remember that this had happened to them. So we got mind engineering going on here. And with this ability to plant false memories, to change what people remember, to tamper with autobiography, there are a lot of ethical issues to think about. And one of those didn't come up on this slide for some reason, is when should we use this mind technology? Should we ever use it? If we could figure out a way to use it to make people live a happier or healthier life, would that be a good idea? I mean, that's not for me to decide. That's for all of you to decide. I'm only here to tell you what's possible. When I look to the future, I don't know, the future, many things may be getting worse. Doctored photographs are here now. This is not so much the future, although the capability and the skill with which people can doctor photographs will improve over time. We did a study where we used doctored photographs and we got people to remember things that were completely made up, like getting people to remember that our former President Obama once shook the hand of the former president of Iran. That's totally created with Photoshop. We made people believe that our former president, George Bush, was vacationing on his ranch with the famous baseball player. And it was during Katrina that he was doing this horrible hurricane that killed so many people. These were doctored photographs, and yet we convinced many people that they had seen these photographs before. And one of the things we found is whether they fell for the suggestion and claimed to see this fake item depended on their political orientation. So the conservative Republicans, for example, were more likely to fall for a suggestion that made the Democratic president look bad, but somewhat less likely to fall for the suggestion that made the Republican candidate look bad. And so this is showing us something about motivated false memories, that we are more likely to develop false memories when it fits with our beliefs, our pre-existing ideas. One of my favorite doctored photograph studies that you might enjoy learning about looked at people's memories for the royal wedding of Kate and Will. It took place in 2011, and there's an actual scene where the couple is departing from the wedding. The investigator, Rob Nash, who you see here, is actually my academic great-grandson, and he's a professor in England now. Well, he doctored that photograph, and he put in a whole lot of protesters and commotion and hostility. And after people viewed this doctored photograph, they remembered the original event differently. They remembered it as being more hostile, and it affected other aspects of their behavior. But the really clever thing, I think, about Nash's study is he had a third condition where the doctored photographs were so poorly done, the horses didn't even have their feet on the ground, and even this obviously fake doctored photograph still influenced people to believe something that wasn't true. The matter is going to get even worse when we think about deep fakes, because if you've read anything about deep fakes, you know it's possible to make an image or a video that shows somebody saying or doing something that they never said or done. One of the earliest ones was that was on our news a lot, showed our president then, Obama, talking And it was his voice, it was his demeanor, it was clearly him. In every way, it looked like him, but it was really the voice of an actor being fed through this computer program who was saying those words and got him to say something that he probably would never, ever say out loud in public, although he might say it privately. And the article, one of the early articles on these deepfakes had the wonderful title, "Fake Media is Coming for Our Memories." Well, fake media is not only coming for our memories, but so is GP chat and other large language models that communicate with people. In a recent paper that we just released, we showed that if you have a witness to a crime interact with one of these GPT programs that delivers some false memory, it maximizes the rate of false memories. And so I'm going to sit here because I have a little knee problem while I wrap this up with you. I started by asking you, do you think I could make you remember? Could I pour into your mind memories of things that didn't happen? Could I make you remember that when you were a kid you saw a cat stuck in a tree and you went and rescued that cat? Could I make you remember that as a kid you were attacked by a vicious animal? Could I make you remember that as a teenager you committed a crime and it was a serious one, serious enough the police came? And I didn't talk about this great work that came out of Britain. Could I make you remember that a week ago you cheated in a card game and you took money out of the game bank when you weren't entitled to take it? All of these things have been planted in the minds of otherwise healthy, adult, functioning human beings and tell us about the malleable nature of memory. And so I leave you with this. If I've learned anything from all these years of working on these issues, it's this: that just because somebody tells you something and they say it with a lot of confidence, they describe it in a lot of detail, they cry when they tell you it, it doesn't mean that it really happened. False memories can have these same characteristics. You need independent corroboration to know whether you're dealing with a genuine memory or one that is a product of suggestion, imagination, confusion of a dream with a real experience, or some other process. So one of my favorite quotes out there in the real world is this from Salvador Dali. You might have come across it. He's the one who said that the difference between false memories and true ones is the same as for jewels. It's always the false ones that look the most real, the most brilliant. And if I could meet Saul, which I can't yet, anyhow, because he's passed away, yeah, I would say, you almost got it right, but it's not the case that the false ones are the most real and the most brilliant. But what it is true, and what the science does say, is they can look equally real and equally brilliant. So, grazie. Thank you for listening. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Grazie mille per la conferenza che è stata.
Thank you very much for the conference. It's been very, very interesting and fascinating. I suppose there must be so many questions in the room because there's so many of you, and I think that the topic really concerns us all. So I'm not going to steal time
Alle vostre domande.
to your questions. I only have one for the moment, and then we will see if it's enough to break the ice. The first question I have
questa evidenza. Mi sente correttamente?
Can you hear me? Can you hear the translation? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? 1, 2, 3. I'm testing. Yes. I think there's a volume. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Can you hear the translation? Is it loud enough? Is it loud enough? Okay. Thank you. No.
Covering up the translation, and I can't hear it. And do you want to
I can ask it in English,
ask it in
if that's okay.
Italian and then English, maybe? No?
Parlo
Italian
vado in
and then-
inglese?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Is it too low? When he's not talking, yeah, okay, yeah, I see, that's the problem. Yeah, of course, because he's covering my voice, probably. Let's see if it's any better now. 1, 2, 3. Maybe, could you maybe wear both headsets? Would it be better? Do you have two? No. So these scientific... No.
Queste scoperte scientifiche
These scientific discoveries are telling us that we can not really trust our memories, and we can't trust other people's memories either. How does it make you feel that you contributed to this loss of trust, basically? And what do you think could be done to find a remedy to this, especially in those contexts in which we realize that memory is not enough? People's memories are not enough. So what could we do to, to trust people more, to get to trust people more?
So I heard the question, and that was a long question. That was a long question, but maybe. Well, I think the basic message from my work is that we should maybe trust people less. So you're asking me what can we do to make people trust more? I don't think that's necessarily a good goal. I want people to not simply assume that when you hear a story that's detailed and confident and emotional, that it has to be true. I would like to see people understand the false memory potential and realize there's an alternative for where this may have come from. Now, the other part of that long question, it seemed to be asking what else can people do? And maybe there are some things you can do to try to protect yourself from being contaminated. We know that if you warn people about the potential for false memories, they can fend off some of the negative influence. We're not usually walking around the streets with big warning flashes all the time, and so we don't take advantage of that. But it is possible to scrutinize information more carefully than perhaps we do, and at least ask the question, is this true or false, rather than just accepting it as true. Okay, we're trying something new here.
Un'altra domanda che mi permette di fare subito.
I have another question. I don't know if you can hear me a bit better now. 1, 2, 3. Yes, okay, great.
Crede che
Do you think more should be done from the point of view of training people, for instance, who do interrogatories, even interrogations, where there's a lot of pressure maybe? I'm thinking about the police, for instance. Should they be aware of these mechanisms? Should we do more to inform them, to train them? Or maybe there should be more control on the way in which these interrogations are carried out, because there is this potential to plant misinformation and to condition what people will say later about what they've done. And there are cases, legal cases, in which this has become relevant. I mean, do you think more training should be provided?
So this new method is very good. I can hear everything. So on the question of training, well, many people who work in my field do spend time, maybe I shouldn't say many, but quite a few, interacting with police, law enforcement, other agencies that do interrogations and have to investigate crimes and accidents and other important events. And so there has been some education of law enforcement, and we do see some changes in the way they do things. So for example, there are changes when you're trying to elicit an identification of a perpetrator. Many agencies now are using something that was recommended by the science that says that the person who conducts the test should not know who the suspect is. The officer that brings the witness to a lineup should not know which of those people is the suspect. It's called blind testing. It's something that's highly recommended by the science. And so why is blind testing a good idea? When in the old days, they always had the main investigator do the test, and he knew who the suspect was. This way, with blind testing, you eliminate the prospect of the investigator inadvertently cueing the witness, which would be bad, cueing them as to who they should pick. And you also eliminate the ability of the investigator to give the witness feedback about their choice. Because when investigators give a witness feedback about their choice, when they say something like, good job, you picked the person we believe it is, or you picked the suspect and we think we have his fingerprints at the scene, that feedback influences a witness, makes them more confident, makes them change their memory to be more detailed and to give better information, but wrong information. By better, I mean better in terms of it being aligned with this being the true perpetrator when it's not. So that's one example where at least some investigators are listening to this work, and some agencies are responding with policy changes or procedural changes.
Grazie della risposta.
Thank you very much for your answer. We have a question from the web, and then we pass to the audience. From the web, the question is connected to what we were saying before. We could maybe use this weakness of memory positively. And this concerns people suffering from depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. So the people suffering from this, this is the question, depression and post-traumatic stress disorder alter memory, suppressing traumatic memories, but also erasing positive memories. And they are more subject to memory manipulation. Do you think if they have depression or PTSD, are they more subject, more susceptible to memory manipulation?
So I do know of just a small amount of work that shows that people with PTSD might be somewhat more susceptible to contamination. There's not a lot of work on that subject. But more, I think the bigger question here is whether or not you could, I mean, we've shown you can use these techniques and influence people's thinking and their behavior. It's been done with food and alcohol and, you know, in some other ways. In principle, we could develop some techniques that maybe would help with somebody who has depression. It would be a pure speculation at this point whether a false memory approach to doing that would help them in the long run. And so it would only be a speculation. I will say, though, that what this brings to mind for me is I know of research that shows that on our own, we, people in general, tend to remember they got grades that were better than they did, or they voted in elections they didn't vote in, or they gave more to charity than they really did, or they had children that walked and talked at an earlier age than they really did. These are prestige-enhancing memory distortions that we do to ourselves. There's no external suggestion of the sort that I use in my experiments. We do it to ourselves. And depressed people don't do it that often. And that's why sometimes they're described as being sadder but wiser. Well, the non-depressed people who do this, maybe these allow us to feel better about ourselves and help fend off a bit of sadness or depression.
Grazie, interessante.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Let's give the floor to the audience. There is one hand raised here. Please raise your hand again so that the volunteers can see you and bring you the microphone. Thank you very much. Very interesting lecture. I am a juror, and when I examine witnesses, I try and think what you said. I don't trust the fact that they will be telling the truth. My role is to understand, or better, when I was young, I was thinking whether they were lying. Then, sorry, she said juror, but actually she meant a judge. And my experience showed me that people are actually convinced of what they say they remember. And then we have the cross-examination, and after the cross-examination, oftentimes people start being doubtful of what they said. My question is the following. I am a civil law judge. I deal with torts, even accidents, for instance, labor, occupational accidents. In the Italian system, it is the judge asking the questions. It's not the attorneys. The attorney can write the questions, but the judge reviews these questions. So no, let's say, suggestive information is provided. Have you ever carried out such an experiment, planting false memories and then cross-examining these people? Because I was wondering whether, thanks to cross-examinations, it is easier to understand that the memory is false. In other words, if to us this is very important legally, it is also a way to understand how frail the human mind can be.
Altre domande?
Okay, thank you.
Are there questions?
Your question. Well, first of all, by the time the witness gets to the trial, whether it's testimony to a judge or in many cases in my country, it's to a jury, supposedly a jury of peers, they have gone through often a great deal of preparation. So they have rehearsed their memories. They've been practiced with their memories. And while I admit that cross-examination can and does play a role in presenting a counter-narrative and maybe helping a witness question the memory a little bit, by the time they get into court, sometimes this memory is so solidified that even cross-examination can't really make much of a dent in it. And so, for example, we know that if you constantly reinforce somebody's memory and you give them feedback, even if it's wrong, you tell them they're right, you increase their confidence, you change other ways they talk about the memory, and you make them more impervious to cross-examination. So I don't think we can simply decide that cross-examination is the perfect panacea to the problems that this kind of work exposes.
Grazie. Ci sono altre domande?
Thank you very much. Are there further questions here in the front rows? Thank you very much. This was a very interesting lecture. Out of curiosity, I have a very simple question. Am I saying the truth if I maintain that we tend to remember more things that are pleasant to us or seem pleasant to us? I'm not referring to traumatic events because I'm convinced, pretty much convinced that one might say one thing but then actually lived another one. And in the long run, memory might reject unpleasant events. And other people then can influence us. For instance, we do not remember an event well, but then if there are suggestive information given by other people, then we remember them better.
Well, there is a fair amount of work on whether an event is a positive experience or a negative one. And you know, some of it shows that we might hang on to the positive memories a little bit more. We also have done work, though, that shows that it's a little easier to plant a positive false memory than a negative one. But we do have to keep in mind that, you know, despite the fact that what we know is that important events are probably remembered better than unimportant ones, important events that are positive and negative are remembered better than unimportant neutral events that don't matter very much to us, that both of these types of memories are susceptible to contamination. And that's something that we need to worry about when it's important. I mean, it's not always important. It isn't important if I tell you that, you know, for lunch today I had pasta instead of a hamburger. I might tell you that, you might listen. It doesn't really matter if it's a mistake and I don't get caught. But when it comes to testimony that's being given in these legal cases and when somebody's liberty is at stake or lots of money in a civil case, then precise memory does matter. And again, both positive and negative memories are potentially subject to contamination.
Ok, nell'attesa di vedere se ci sono altre domande.
While waiting for further questions, and indeed there are questions, I'll read one from the chat. I read one question from the chat, which should be projected here. The question concerns the opportunity to manipulate memories in smaller children. Are they more susceptible to manipulation than adults?
Well, that's an easy question for me because there are studies that show that young children, especially the 4 to 6 year old children, are more susceptible to contamination than older children and adults. And there have been a number of these false memory type of studies that have been done with young children that are actually fascinating studies where all kinds of things have been planted into the minds of these young children. I'm thinking of one study where the young children were led to believe that on some occasion they got their hand caught in a mousetrap and they had to go to the hospital to get the mousetrap removed. And further questioning of the children about, after they developed this memory, who took you to the hospital? And they would give an answer of a person. And who was with you when you came home from the hospital? And they'd give an answer so they could elaborate on these completely made up scenarios. So out there in the real world, particularly in the 1980s, in North America, we began to see all kinds of these daycare cases where these young children were claiming that they had been, molested in satanic rituals, flown off to distant places. Daycare workers were accused, they were prosecuted, they were sued civilly. And for the most part, despite some very sad convictions, most of these cases were overturned or are finally done with, but not until a number of people spent some time in jails or prisons.
Grazie, procediamo con la domanda qua in seconda fila.
Let's move ahead with questions from the floor here in the room.
Grazie professoressa.
Thank you, Professor Loftus. I have two questions, hopefully easy ones. Are there measurements of these evidence, if the evidence was tested using fMRI or similar quantitative measurement devices, or what was going on in the brain of these people? Whether then you believe that in the future devices changing neural signals, so neural links, could change memories. And then second question, the future of memory. Because there are more and more devices that we use, glasses with webcams, mobile phones, devices, taking a picture of what's going on in your body. So I'd like to know, what kind of memory will we develop in the future, given that we use so many devices? Might this help us solving legal problems, or might this help us remembering better?
Well, taking on that second question first, will these devices help us remember better? I mean, certainly they help us, know where to look for information, and so we don't have to, we know it can be easy to look for information by just typing in a Google search bar. But in some ways, these devices make us remember worse. So I used to know all the telephone numbers of my close friends and family members. I knew it by heart. I don't know any of their phone numbers anymore because I just have to push a button on my phone with their name on it, and it calls the number, whatever that number is. So you could see an example there where these devices are impairing memory, not helping it. And so I think what we'll find in the future as we see further development of these kinds of aids and devices is it'll help some and maybe hurt others. As far as the neuroimaging is concerned, I kind of alluded in my talk to just one study that we did that showed that the neural signals that you can see with functional magnetic resonance imaging or some other device like that show a great similarity between true memories and false memories. There's much more success telling the difference between a deliberate lie and a true memory using like neuroimaging. But as far as a false memory that somebody really believes in versus a true memory, very similar. So we are a long way off before we are going to be in a position where we can do what the legal system wants us to do, is take one memory and ask, is this real or is it not real?
C'è una domanda in fondo alla sala.
There is a question down there.
C'è una domanda in prima fila.
Well, actually, there is a question here, front row. Thank you. At a time when a traumatic memory is there, is planted, but it is a false memory, will trauma follow? Is there going to be a retroactive effect of trauma if the memory of trauma is false and it has been planted artificially?
This question prompts me to want to tell you about an experience that I had when I first started looking at these, what we thought were questionable claims of repressed memories that had returned and now were being expressed. I ended up having access to some information from our Crime Victims Compensation Fund. The Crime Victims Compensation Fund was a fund that was set up in the state where I was living at the time, which happened to be the state of Washington, to compensate people who were crime victims. They could be victims of assault or robbery or child abuse or some other crime. And this fund would help them and give them some funds for, medical help or therapy help or, compensation for property that was lost or something like that. There was a subset of these cases that you might call the repressed memory cases, where they went into therapy and developed these false memories. And when these cases were analyzed, not only did these claimants get much, much, much more money out of the fund, much, much more compensation out of the fund than all the other categories of crime victimization, but there was also evidence that these people were, in some sense, worse off than they were before they went into therapy. Before they went into therapy, they were employed, they were married, they were happy. After they go into therapy and they end up being hospitalized and getting depressed and losing their job and getting divorced and cutting themselves. And so I worry, based on those crime victim compensation data, that these false memories can have terrible consequences for people and really make them worse off than they were before.
Grazie. Ora domande prima fila.
Yes, there's a question in the first row. Thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask you this. Do you have any tip, any advice that we can put in practice every day to strengthen, to reinforce memory? Because memory is so fragile.
I don't see who's asking the question. I'm told it's the front row, but okay. But wherever you are. There are lots of books out there that will give you tips on how to remember things better. While I'm sitting here visiting with you in Bergamo, I'll just give you one tip. You know what it's like to go to a function or go to a party or go somewhere, and you are introduced to people and then you immediately forget their name. There are things you can do to maximize the chances that you remember that name. One, no surprise, is to rehearse it. But how should you rehearse it? Do you just say to yourself, Susan Smith, Susan Smith, Susan Smith? If you mass your rehearsals together, it doesn't help very much. You need to space them out. But what should the spacing look like? And the best spacing is an expanding pattern of rehearsal. You wait 30 seconds, you say to yourself, or say out loud is even better, but if it's awkward to say it out loud, Susan Smith. Then you wait another couple of minutes, Susan Smith. Then you might wait 15 minutes, Susan Smith. That expanding pattern of rehearsal is the best way to lock that information into your long-term memory. That's just one tip, no charge.
Altre domande? Ce n'è una lì.
Okay, we have another question here. And I think one back there. Okay, back and then in front. Thank you very much. Up to now, we spoke about a memory which is basically personal, of the individual. We know that there's also a social, collective memory. So my question is this: is it possible, is it that easy, is it just as easy to plant false memories in collective memory? Or the continuous interaction amongst individual works like a raincoat, let's say, and makes it more difficult as a protection, let's say, and it's more difficult to plant a false information in the memories of so many people. Thank you.
I love that raincoat example. I figure I'm going to steal that and use that somewhere to talk about the protective ability. But back to collective memory. Sometimes what people are remembering are things that happen out there in our society. And these memories, too, can be contaminated. One of the examples that we did was to try to contaminate memory for what happened in Tiananmen Square in China when the protesters were pretty much tormented or massacred, whatever you want to say. And we did that with doctored photographs. We planted a crowd around when it was a single lone guy in front of a tank. And it affected the way people then remembered this iconic bit of collective memory. So you can alter collective memories through doctored photographs or through other means. I think it would be it's sort of like comparing collective apples to personal oranges. They're very different kinds of memories, but if anything, I think it might be easier to contaminate a collective memory because it's not so personal to you. But again, that's an empirical question and hard to know how you would measurement. I have to think about that a little more.
Le false memorie.
False memories, do they happen to everybody indistinctly, or is there a social category that's more vulnerable? For instance, young people, the elderly?
Well, I partially answered this question earlier when I said that young children are more susceptible to contamination. There also is some evidence that the elderly are also somewhat more susceptible to false memories than younger adults. It's kind of an upside-down U-curve in terms of how good memory will be when exposed to contaminating information. There are other ways in which the elderly, through wisdom or other kinds of experience, do have better memories for some kinds of information, however. But in terms of being able to contaminate, there may be a bit more of a problem there. But, again, I feel that this is something that is true of all of us, and even people who've spent their entire career studying false memories. As happened in my case, just to tell you this story that I hope I won't get upset when I tell this story. I lost my mother when she was 14 years old. She drowned in a swimming pool. And many, many years later, I went to a 90th birthday party of one of my uncles, and one of my relatives told me at this birthday party that I'm the one who had found my mother's body in the swimming pool. And I said to him, no, I didn't find the body. Her sister, my aunt, found the body. It wasn't me. He was so insistent, this relative. He was absolutely certain I had found the body. So I went home from this birthday party thinking to myself, well, it was a long time ago. Maybe I did find the body. Maybe that's one other thing I remembered is that the fire department came and they gave me oxygen. Maybe they gave me that oxygen because I was so upset because I found the body. I started to envision my mother lying in the pool, face down. I could see her. And then a few days later, my relative called me and said, I'm sorry to tell you I made a big mistake. It wasn't you who found the body. It was your aunt, her sister. And I'm sitting here thinking, I've been studying false memories for quite a while. They just ran me in one of my own experiments, and I was on my way to believing and remembering what was a traumatic experience and might have been even more traumatic if I had continued down that road.
Posso chiederti, ma questo ricordo, questo falso ricordo ti è...
This false memory remained? Did something remain of this false memory?
Well, the only thing that remains now is my ability to tell a new group of people about it. I know it's false. I've got enough sadness as it is thinking about being a 14-year-old without a mother. So there'll always be a false memory there. It just won't have exactly this feature to it.
Mi permetto di rubare un'altra domanda, poi vediamo se ce n'è un'ultima dal pubblico.
I'll ask another question, then we'll leave the floor to the audience again.
Possono spiegare
Can false memories partially explain the fact that many people remember having experiences that are difficult to be believed, such as paranormal ones, being kidnapped by aliens, or having had seen ghosts? We tend to believe that these are liars, or that they had delusions, hallucinations, or they dreamt it. Do you believe that false memories can be an explanation for these events?
I definitely believe that false memories can be an explanation for these events, and that in many cases some authority figure maybe has been involved in planting these false memories. I'm thinking of the work on alien abduction memories. We share the planet with some people who believe that they were abducted by aliens, that they were taken up to spaceships, that they were sexually experimented upon, and then they were returned to their beds on Earth. It's possible that some of them are lying, but I believe many of them, and many of them are very high-functioning people. They've got good jobs, they're getting along, they're not crazy people talking to themselves out in the street. So how did they get this way? They often ended up with a psychiatrist who believes that alien abduction is happening. And one in particular has since passed away is John Mack from the Harvard Medical School, who would then and they would come to John Mack describing an experience of sleep paralysis. If you've ever had this, there is a situation where sometimes people will wake up from being asleep and they can't move. It's a sleep paralysis that maybe protects us from sleepwalking. In any event, it's kind of terrifying if it happens to you and you have no idea what it is. They go to John Mack, Dr. Mack, and say, I had this, I couldn't move when I woke up. And he convinces them and hypnotizes them to help remember that they were abducted by aliens. These people who believe they were abducted by aliens have now been studied extensively by a Harvard psychologist named Richard McNally, and they're very emotional about these false memories when they tell you about them, even if it seems exceedingly unlikely that these are actual experiences. So would it work for ghosts, and would it work for other paranormal, and would this explain people who claim to have past life memories? I think all of these are possible, and that we don't have to assume these are big fat liars. They could actually come to honestly believe this. And that's a kinder way to feel about people when they tell you something that you don't think is true.
Grazie. Mi dicono che abbiamo spazio per un ultimo.
I've been told that we just have room for one very, very last question. One here, please. Or there, I don't know.
Grazie.
Mi chiedevo,
I was wondering whether, well beyond the possibility of planting false memories, can you also remove true memories? So besides planting false memories, you can remove true memories.
Well, first of all, erasing a memory is a little harder to do. But to some extent, what we've done in these studies is by substituting a new memory, we're weakening the old one. When I make you believe it's a yield sign, I weaken the memory, the true memory of the stop sign. So in that sense, we're sort of partially erasing a memory using these techniques, but just trying to eliminate people's memories, we found that harder to do. Interestingly, there is in the clinical trials on a drug called propranolol that you can sometimes take if you've had a traumatic experience. You take this drug, maybe in the emergency room. It weakens your memory for the trauma and supposedly reduces the chances that you'll develop post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a debilitating condition. And we did a study where we asked people, if you had a traumatic experience and you were in the emergency room and you were offered propranolol and you were told it would weaken your memory and reduce your chances of getting PTSD, would you take it? And I had a collaborator who I personally said, yes, give it to me. My collaborator said, no, I wouldn't take it. So we decided to find out what ordinary people think. And to my surprise, about 80% of people said they didn't want it. They were afraid of it. What else would it do? What other side effects? Just so uncomfortable with tampering with their memory. And I just found that interesting that I was in the minority, at least on this question of what people think they would want to do. For me, you know, eliminating pain seems like a good thing to do, but for other people, they don't want to take the risk.
So che ho detto che era l'ultima domanda.
I know that I said this was the very last question, but there is another person down there who would like to ask this question. So the very last question, please.
Può rialzare la mano chi aveva alzato la mano prima?
Can you kindly raise your hand again so that we can see you?
Allora, la mia domanda è
My question is very much related to the previous one, because I'd like to know whether, thanks to the illusion of memory, given that we spoke about planting, for instance, a false memory on some foods, could you plant some false memories to avoid phobias? Could this be applied in medicine to fight depression, for instance?
Well, on the question of phobias, it does seem in principle, again, I would like to see a study first before I do anything other than just speculate, but in principle, it does seem as if maybe you could plant some false memories of people who were very afraid of spiders or had fear of flying or some of the things that people have phobias about, that you might be able to plant a false memory of a successful, happy experience with the object of your phobia. And maybe that would work to help reduce the phobia reaction or cure the phobia. As for figuring out curing depression, I'm not sure where I would begin. As I said earlier, these prestige-enhancing memory distortions that occur in many of us, but not so much in depressed people, maybe that would be a place to start for some new PhD student who's looking for a dissertation. Maybe trying to develop prestige-enhancing memories in a depressed person might actually, help make a difference. But again, it's all an empirical question, and at this point, just a pure speculation that it might possibly work.
Grazie mille.
Thank you so much, Professor Loftus. It was a very interesting conference indeed. Thank you to you all for attending the conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.